Thank you for being here. Well, we'll call this meeting to order. I see no public, so,
We being televised?
yeah, I think we
are.
are. So let's go ahead. We've got a lot to cover. A lot of updates. We haven't convened for a while, and there's a lot going on. So.
Yeah, there just happens to be a
Combination.
lot that's been moving. So I'm going to start with the state school aid budget. Governor Snyder did introduce his budget, and the good news is it's a good budget so far. We're very encouraged by it. We're hopeful that it remains intact. It's a $14.1 billion budget overall, with an increase of between $60 and $120 per pupil distributed through the 2X formula. GRPS would be getting at the 120 rate based on the executive recommendations. So our foundation allowance would go from $7,391 to $7,511. This would generate about $2 million in new revenue for the district based on our current enrollment. It did put a greater weight on the per pupil count. The way we do count day is 90 in the fall, 10 in the spring. This would go to a 50-50 count, which would actually help to soften the blow of declining enrollment on budgets. This would maintain the retirement investments in the UAAL with a commitment of around $89 million. That would now have a line item totaling almost $1 billion for the MIPSers, and that's both for the offset as well as the unfunded liabilities.
There will be a push. There will be a push to get that into the foundation allowance.
Right. We know friends at GLEP and some of the other individuals that are pro-charter see this as money that should just all go into foundation allowance, and that it's right now this is money that only goes to public school districts that are paying into MIPSers.
Is there?
We'll continue to
Yeah.
Interesting.
advocate for that.
One new item is $10 million for evaluation, training, and professional development. This is something that there's legislation that's been going through, obviously, around evaluation and professional development. We do not know, unless Chris, maybe, or Rusty, you may know how they're going to go about distributing those funds.
Yeah, so MDE, there's currently 14 million under their jurisdiction right now, per not this previous budget cycle, but was appropriated the one before that and carried forward. So they're just starting to get details. It looks like it will be kind of an ISD led by a per pupil allocation, and then it'll flow to the districts from there. So some of the rules are still forthcoming. They're actually going to finalize those rules and the distribution for that 14 million at the next State Board of Education meeting on March 8th. And the governor's proposed budget allocates an additional 10 million for ongoing training and professional development for evaluation models as well. So.
Maintaining the 31A investment from the previous year, you might recall that was increased last year by $100 million. They're continuing that again, so that's another benefit to us. One that Rusty and I are particularly excited about is the special ed itinerant funding for the first time in, I don't know when, since you and I have been here, so 8 or 9 years. We did not have to fight. The special ed itinerant funding is in the governor's proposed budget. It is based on last year, capped at $2 million. But at least it's there, and we don't have to fight for it again.
And this was a line item that was supposed to be ended in 2012, I think was the first time they said they were going to end this. So not only is it not ending, but we were able to give it in the governor's proposed budget. It was a very nice bone thrown to us by the administration.
That was. Would maintain significant investment in GSRP. Remember, they've kind of doubled down over the last couple of years. They are continuing that investment on the preschool. One that Larry brought to my attention here recently is the transfer rules being eliminated in the proposed budget. Right now, we lose upwards of 25 to 50 kids between the two count days. And basically, by them eliminating this transfer rule, that's going to be a financial benefit to us because we're going to get the part of their count when the kids were with us. Did I say that right?
Yes. The reason they're able to do that is because right now we're under a 90% fall count, 10% prior spring. When they go to a 50-50, they feel like it evens out that you're going to have incentive to try to keep as many kids as you can through the spring because that count is weighted so heavily. So there's no sense in having all of the administration that goes along with tracking each day, how many days they were with your district to the T. Because what they found was there was a lot of paperwork and there was little money that was actually being shifted. between the districts.
Oh, that's great. That's a good change.
There's the establishment of a Detroit Public School Trust Fund that's going to utilize the tobacco settlement funds to place $72 million per year for 10 years, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the DPS. But the good news on that is that they're not using K-12. The big worry was that they were going to use K-12 school aid to pay for the DPS bailout, and instead they're going to rely on tobacco settlement, and I'll talk about that more later. One that's notable is they're establishing $9 million fund to reimburse school districts for costs associated with the voluntary testing for water, lead in water. That's something that the governor highlighted in his State of the State. So we knew that there was going to be either his was voluntary. We actually anticipate it may become mandatory at some point. We as a district have already conducted our tests. We were being proactive. I know that Ken Klomparens is at this point just waiting for the final executive summary, but everything looks good.
This is testing the school water?
Tested the schools.
Got
My understanding is all 52 of our schools were tested within the last, correct.
Drink up.
So once again, as you can, we like to lead by example. We were already ahead of the curve on this. We anticipated that it was coming. Hopefully we might be, it was a minimal, it's like $10,000 or $15,000 investment on our part, but results look very positive. And then lastly, it continues the investment. You might recall when we were talking about the third grade reading, last year's budget had money in there for strategies to improve child literacy, and this continues at $23.9 million. And I think that's about it. Is there any-
Specify what those are to be used for, or?
For proven strategies to improve child literacy. I'm guessing it's everything from professional development to effective strategies in instructional practice, possibly technology supports. I don't know. Larry, do you know how those dollars are, how we received those dollars last year?
It's still actually getting distributed to us, so that hasn't happened from MDE, so that's flowing down. But it'll go to support literacy coaches. It'll also help offset some costs of some early literacy screening tools, diagnostic tools, and then some other mechanisms within there. I do know that last year there was a $1 million appropriation for the Michigan Education Corps, which was led by Hope Network, and GRPS has some schools involved in that program. At this point in time, that line item is not in the governor's budget, so I imagine there'll be some work around that. But a lot of it is within the literacy coaches, and then there's also some resources allocated for additional instructional time based on how many first grade students you have. So there'd be an allocation if you wanted to extend that school year for those kids for early literacy initiatives, you could do so and recoup some of those resources from the state.
So this may not be a question for legislative, but with this literacy piece, I know, what's the guy's name who was funding some literacy?
John Kennedy.
Thank you. And I know that he was chair of that governor-appointed committee to design some of this. So I guess my question, do we know if those dollars is part of that, trying to take some of that work to scale, or we don't know?
I'm not sure if I remember from the press conference that and the recommendations that came out of that bicameral bipartisan task force. There was talk about the need to be able to invest in these strategies that are from K through 3. So I think it's connected. I think I think there's definitely an interrelation. But when it comes to the things we're learning from the Kennedy schools, I would guess that would count toward proven strategies if we can demonstrate
If it's
the
proven,
results.
I guess that's where I was going.
And I think that's, what we're seeing is that they are proven, the numbers are moving, some of the things that are there, but again, we don't think we know enough about how they're going to implement it and how they're going to divvy up the dollars.
Well, and remember, we don't have a third grade reading bill.
And we don't have a
It's
third
not
grade
done.
reading bill yet.
It's sitting in the Senate right now.
Do you have a sense of how the other budgets are going to line up? Do you anticipate, what are the big differences you anticipate?
Yeah, well, the old rule is the executive proposes and the legislature disposes. So there'll be some different priorities, I think, from the legislature than you saw from the governor's office. It's an all-spend budget, which you haven't seen in a Snyder administration up to this point. There's usually been some sort of contribution to the rainy day fund, $150 million or $200 million, whatever it is, some effort to pay down future liabilities. There's none of that in here. Most of those dollars have gone into his Flint proposal, which is 195 million total in the budget. Whether or not the legislature sees fit to spend that much is yet to be seen, but this is an all-spend budget, so anything that they do will result in taking from somewhere to put somewhere else, as opposed to a rainy day budget. So, but, you know, your transportation package got passed, and while it wasn't as significant as some would have liked, it will relieve a great deal of the pressure on the general fund that you've seen in previous years where they put money directly in from the general fund. The mega tax credits that were such a sort of onerous sort of Damocles hanging over the budget's head, those have all sort of been renegotiated, so at least they're known what their liability is going to be over time. So that has had some implication on that. Healthy Michigan has been, depending on how you view the world, more successful because there are more signups than they thought there were going to be. You can look at that as, well, there are more people without health care than we thought, and B, well, now we have people with health care. But this is the first year that the state has to start picking up a portion of the expansion of Healthy Michigan. So there are a tremendous amount of pressures on the general fund. And frankly, given all those pressures and given everything that's sort of happened, the budget looks pretty good.
Yeah.
Depending on, I think it'll be sliding around where the legislature wants to spend money, not the amount. So.
And it's election season, so our hope is that they don't play too many games and push it through.
You mentioned briefly about the MIPSR's offset being rolled into the per pupil. Does that really have any traction?
It hasn't been successful in previous years. I just know we have to be vigilant about it. And when we do our meetings and those kinds of things, we have to talk about how important that is. That's sort of the dichotomy here. There are folks who want to say our foundation allowance hasn't gone up, but if they put it all in the foundation allowance, then it's spread over obviously a wider group of students. So I don't think it does, but haven't we'll see.
Nice work on the itinerant funding. Awesome.
That was a team effort, and the budget director was very open to this discussion, and Senator Hildebrand once again needs to be given kudos because they specifically did not want to have to fight with him, and that's one of the reasons it was in.
Good.
So.
Moving on.
Yep.
House Bill 5194, which it's really 5193 and 5194, but the one that you currently have a position in your legislative platform is relevant to 5194. This is the bill that would make the school year calendar and school year schedule prohibited subjects for collective bargaining. This bill moved out of committee and is now on the House floor. Teresa did testify recently, although it was a relatively abbreviated testimony because the time that was taken on the, I call them the pre-Labor Day school start, which probably isn't the right terminology, but House Bill 5193 would essentially codify the waiver process for if we want to start schools before Labor Day. Right now, we seek a waiver, but it's done on an individual school basis, and the state has discretion to say yay or nay. This 5193 says if you meet certain criteria, you're automatically granted that waiver.
It's a shall issue.
It's a shall issue, not may. And part of the things that was said during testimony was the ISD, we are actually requesting an ISD-wide waiver, so there's no inconsistency. So not one district's on a post-labor, another district's on a pre-Labor Day. This legislation doesn't cover that, but that's certainly something we've talked about.
What are the conditions that they're suggesting? I mean, in the proposed legislation, what are they?
So right now, MDE is that year-round or bona fide year-round calendar. A lot of that is in regards to a balanced calendar. So on a certain number of days off, a couple weeks. They also have the ability for, if you have a middle college or a program that aligns with a post-secondary institution, then you can get automatic approval. But again, it's just for that program. It's not district-wide. And I think from what the GRPS example is that we need to be able to have consistency among our system because there's so many things that interact with one another that to put a few schools on a different calendar to another one can be counterproductive. So those are some of the things we continue to push forward. Even this legislation, as simple as it is getting some pretty strong resistance from the tourism industry.
Yeah.
So I know Representative Garcia had some conversations with her is looking at whether or not to go forward with 5194, which is a prohibited subject bill, and potentially do some more work on the
Right.
school start date bill. But
They're not tie-barred, so she doesn't
They're
have
not
to run
tie-barred.
them together.
A couple of the other things were something about if the school was on trimesters, 5%, if they're on the 5% list. I think those were the only other ones. And if there's already on an extended year calendar, if they have a school that's already on an extended year calendar.
Yeah, essentially, if you had gotten a waiver in the past, now you wouldn't have to reapply every year. But I think our friends in the tourism industry were concerned that because it was a shall issue, that more may apply since they didn't have to do it every year. So 6 one, half dozen the other.
Moving on, third grade reading, we heard earlier, House Bill 4822. It did, as you recall, pass the House and is now in Senate Education Committee waiting action. Chris?
I'm hearing February and March, or not February, March and April, excuse me.
yeah, within the next several weeks, maybe towards the few is the latest I've heard. So Senator Pavlov's been reaching out, providing, getting stakeholder input on the topic. We had a number of our priorities that were met within the House of Representatives, so we feel pretty comfortable where the legislation's at, but I do know other groups are working towards parental opt-out options or district opt-out options to the mandatory retention piece.
It's only likely to get better for the districts in terms of what control that they have. We obviously got a delayed implementation in the House, even a year longer than we had anticipated that we would get. And in the Senate, it's only going to get, I think, more favorable to districts and local control. I'll say it that way.
It's good.
Next, sinking fund, which is House Bill 4388. This would limit the amount of years that a sinking fund can go out, but it would expand what we could spend the dollars on and to include technology and security. And thanks to our friends in the House, it did pass out of the House Appropriations Committee, as I understand it, and is now awaiting action on the House floor.
This is the first time there's been a sinking fund bill moved from committee since 2009. So it passed on a 29-0 vote. A lot of thanks to Larry and his team and a number of other districts who provided examples on how much that added cost really does increase the tax burden on businesses and residences. So with that end and that messaging, we've had some positive discussions with House leadership. We don't foresee a hang up within the House of Representatives. So
Is there anyone opposing this? Why would they?
not openly.
Yeah, quietly, behind
Well,
the scenes.
GLEP wasn't too quiet.
Yeah,
The charter schools are the only group that was a known opposition, and it's more of an equity thing that they push for within this. It's not a matter of what's the most efficient tax revenue stream to cover the purchase. It's more of we don't have access to it, so we'd rather not have expanded use of it, which I think legislators say.
Feels kind of petty.
we're not really doing anything with bonding or restricting.
Yeah,
what
it's
we
changing
can
that.
buy,
You're
so-
just changing the use of it, yeah.
Well, and he won't say it, nor should he, but Chris almost on his own has strapped this to his back and carried it. He's doing a heck of a job with that committee and working with the sponsors. And I know lots of people have helped with information, but Chris has been a driver on this, and the Talent Triangle certainly deserves a lot of credit for moving this across the finish line. So we're going to keep working. We got to make sure it gets into the Appropriations Committee in the Senate and doesn't end up in Senate Education, because we've got a problem if it does, I
Yeah.
think. But we'll see. But Chris deserves a lot of credit.
It's great.
Happy to do it.
Next one, critical shortage. We can check that one off the list. The bill was signed by the governor, and we now have Public Act 219. As you might recall, this was legislation that would allow us to bring back retired teachers and administrators based on the critical shortage list. And that's almost 2 years in the making. So it's a big win for us. As you can see, we're
You
getting,
guys are just checking them off.
we're getting lots of movement and action.
Awesome.
The next one is the charter school, and there really isn't legislation yet that's been introduced. There's one Senate Bill 311 that is not likely to go anywhere, but I thought it would be important to put this on there for discussion because the Education Trust Midwest just released their charter school accountability report called Accountability for All. They're recommending a performance-based charter school accountability system. The report really highlights how Michigan is, there really is little accountability for authorizers, and there's really, no one individual or entity that's really regulating these authorizers at this point. And so report findings as examples found that 20% of the Michigan's charter school openings between fall 2011 and fall 2015 were by D or F ranked authorizers. 8 in 10 Michigan charters demonstrated academic achievement that's below the state average. 6 authorizers, though, happened to get an A, and we were one of them. So our authorization of Grand Rapids Child Discovery Center. And what their recommendations are very consistent with what your legislative platform is. It says they're recommending requiring all existing and new authorizers to complete a rigorous application process prior to becoming and remaining a charter authorizer, that we should set rigorous standards for charter school openings, renewals, and expansions, hold authorizers accountable for their school performance based on student learning outcomes, require full transparency for all authorizers, including their schools and operations. This is one that we've said they need to be held to the same transparent standard, and provide special authority for high challenge jurisdictions. I would look to my colleagues here. I think it's highly unlikely we will see much of any action on legislation just because you have a Republican-controlled legislature, and I don't think
Is there any motivation on some of the more stronger authorizers to support something like this?
The report actually outlined on whether or not, one of the ideas that was thrown out there was there's a 3% cap for authorizers right now of what they can get when they authorize a charter school, potentially increasing that as an incentive to get to that higher
administrative fee?
Yeah.
Or how many,
Yep.
increased, yeah.
So that was one of the areas. But what we found with a lot of this stuff is, given the legislative representation in Lansing right now, and that group was really the ones who ushered in expanded choice for charter schools, it becomes so political so quickly that it's tough to look at it in kind of a comprehensive, unbiased way to say, are we doing this like other states are doing? And as Michigan continues this pursuit of being a top 10 state in 10 years, should we look to some other states and how they've managed charter expansion, those kind of things? So the report is another step towards, or nudge towards that direction, but I wouldn't expect to see legislation and a big push. If anything, the conversation in Detroit might help spur it a little bit further, but when we get to that topic, you'll see too that there starts to be a pretty clear breakdown between the charter sector as well as the traditional sector.
Do we have the largest numbers of for-profit charters in the country? Is that just something in my head?
We're in
Or
the top 4.
okay.
Consider this,
I would imagine the budgeting, the transparency in the books would be huge.
this is more of a John the Baptist moment for the crying out in the wilderness for some action to be taken.
Yeah, right.
But we wanted to bring it before you just because it's obviously it's consistent with your legislative platform. There's some statistics they've put in there that are pretty telling about, when comparing apples to oranges, and whether, while there's this perception that the grass is greener on the other side and charters are doing better, it just doesn't show that on paper. And that really, having a Wild West free-for-all of charter school in Michigan is not the answer to our overall academic achievement solutions. It's maybe having that as part of a portfolio, the way we've approached it, but this report's really putting a spotlight on these issues that the legislature at some point in time may have to deal with.
Would you say drafted that bill?
The 311, I'm not even sure. It's a Democrat in the Senate.
Okay, fair enough.
The Ed Trust Midwest was the group that put the report together.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Ed Trust Midwest has a report. There's not a legislative package yet that mirrors what they have. There was only one that I found, and again, it's not going anywhere.
It's likely they'll take that report around to various stakeholder groups, could be even over here to the west side of the state, gauge support, and then from that, potentially introduce legislation. But even at that point, it's still a large hurdle to overcome to get any action on legislation to address what they're really getting at.
Next, I'd like to pause on the ESSA reauthorization and maybe save that for another, just because it's so complex. I mean, the long story short, I guess, is just to emphasize.
ESEA, isn't it?
It's the Every Student Succeeds Act.
Oh, they
ESSA.
changed it, huh?
It is ESEA, but it replaces the NCLB with the ESSA.
Oh, my God.
No,
That sounds
and
like
it's,
It does it ASAP.
The overarching is that it basically did a complete U-turn on No Child Left Behind. It largely minimizes the federal role and enhances the state role. There's not as, the states have much greater discretion on setting goals and establishing the accountability. They removed the federal engagement in teacher evaluation completely, so that's left up to the states. And then there's just more to it. I think it would require, I think we ought to spend time
Yeah,
diving
definitely.
into it as a group.
Especially
rather
since we
than-
missed Washington.
Yeah, because there's also a lot of things, like right now, they got rid of the school improvement grants and in fact are taking 50 different grants and turning them into like a block grant. And so we're still trying to determine how they're going to, they have not been clear yet how Title I is going to get
Yeah.
distributed. I think we ought to get Mel and Larry and a couple others in so we don't spend, the next 20 minutes just trying to
Yeah,
go
it's
through
nothing urgent, it's just.
Yeah, the good news is we're going to be bringing in a speaker from Washington who works with the National Superintendents Association, Noelle Ellerson. She's been close to this the whole time. We're actually at a critical juncture, too, with her work because
What's her name?
Noelle Ellerson. The reason is because there's a lot of rules that have to be promulgated and created with this transformation. So the legislation said, hey, here's clearly the direction we want to go. But there are some nuances that the federal department has to work out. And so they're getting stakeholder feedback. Now, as you can imagine, there's a number of reform-minded groups who liked NCLB and some of those components because it was more mandatory. And you have local districts who are saying, let's turn some of the control back to the states and the local school districts. So that rules-making process will likely be a sticky one
Yeah.
over the next several months in the next year.
Right.
And when is she coming?
We're looking at April, so after spring break.
And
Keep us
depending on-
posted.
I was just going to say, and depending on the timing, I wonder if there's a chance for us to piggyback and have her come to this committee, or,
We can work on that.
so I have two that were not on here that I'm going to add to the legislative updates. One is this legislation that Representative Adam Zemke has introduced about social media. House Bill 4791 would mandate that school districts must have social media policies that specifically address the use of social media and the internet and interactions between students and faculty. And the question really is here, it's been introduced and it's already passed out of the House Education Committee. We anticipate that this may actually have legs.
Is there draft policy out there?
There are draft policies. Sharon Pitts we will have a policy for you here in the next month or so. And so it's something we generally support from an administration standpoint. Our current policies are broadly enough worded that they do govern the use of technology and in communicating in relationships between students and staff. So we are covered currently. This would just be more specific in how it acknowledges the use of social media. So I'm not sure if you want to take a position. We would advocate that it's safe, certainly, for us to take that position. And actually, Adam Zemke's been a colleague and pretty favorable with us on various situations, so it might lend some good support to him if GRPS was on board supporting this.
He's my Facebook friend.
He's mine, too.
Everybody's on. Do not be
We're
flattered.
Instagram friends. I don't know
I'm
if
joking. That was a joke.
I can't believe, I get these things that say 952, and it's like, what are you doing? Serious reading in there?
So I'm not sure if you'd like to propose a position.
Yeah, if somebody want to propose support for Representative Zemke's House Bill 4791?
I guess I want to know, the long and short of it, well, I guess you said, is there any draft language out there? And from what you said, I'm assuming that this bill is simply saying that district needs to have a policy governing social media interactions.
it's not prescriptive in what it says you have to.
It's motivated by an absence of it and it causing problems, or, what's motivating the whole thing?
Situations and trying to outline, what is an acceptable relationship between what a teacher's asking for out of a
Got it,
student,
got it.
those kind of things.
Got it.
So more to spur the conversation.
Right.
You know, MASB is supportive of the bill,
Yeah.
and they also will work with districts to.
And it actually specifies this wouldn't be implemented until wouldn't be mandatory till 2017-18, and that MDE has to develop sample policies. So we might be
Makes a lot of sense to make
the
make
curve.
cultural unanimity regarding protocol. It's like this stuff's gone faster than we've developed the kind of the ethics and protocol around it.
Okay, I'll make a motion to support House Bill 4791.
Have support for that?
Are we at the stage of that?
Put it onto the board, pass it on to the board for approval.
Support.
All in favor? Aye. Pass it on to the board, thanks.
Thank you. Lastly, and Lowell, this one's particularly near and dear to your heart, is our Lieutenant Governor Brian Kelly did introduce did reveal his final recommendations for special education reform. It's 100% in line with what we had presented to you all at your cabinet retreat. These 5 points of the task force recommendations include developing a more inclusive and transparent rulemaking process, improving access to and the scope and quality of services, end the practice of restraint and seclusion, create a better problem-solving process, which was initially referred to as dispute resolution process, and then supporting parents, guardians, and educators with more resources and options. Many of what they're recommending is very much in line with what we're doing. They talk about the more detailed recommendations get into the multi-tiered systems of support, positive behavior interventions and support, a lot of things that were inclusion, significantly greater emphasis on inclusion, more consistency and uniformity in IDP or IEP development and implementation, and again, looking at how we can essentially update our educational services so they're reflective for all students, not silos of special ed versus general ed. There, to my knowledge, is not legislation that's been introduced yet, but we anticipate a package of bills that'll be forthcoming.
And it'll be bipartisan, too.
The only thing that I have any concern about this is, but when you put all special ed in everybody's mind, it seems to me that waters down special ed in some ways, cautious about that. And all of a sudden, we just say, all general ed, you really don't know, so we treat them all like, all of a sudden, you don't have services for kids with that concerns me.
The report does reference the need to tailor the services, that there are students that are going to need a higher level of service, and it may not be in the general ed setting. So it acknowledges that there is a vast, there's a wide kind of range of services from the high needs students to the more lower need students that still need special ed treatment but may be more high functioning. And so we'll have to wait to see what the task force or what the legislative package that comes out. Yeah, I don't think that's where it's going, but I do think it's aimed at looking at, again, how do you bring it in line with the more federal expectations, and looking at some of the antiquated systems that maybe are not being implemented with fidelity as they're expected to. But again, I think we have to wait to see what the bill package is, and I can forward out the report to you so you guys have the details of it. Okay? All right. If it's okay, can I jump to Detroit Public Schools? That really should have just been listed under the legislative update. I don't know. I think it's because it's such a massive piece that we kind of created a separate line item there, but I'll just jump on that before we get to the platform. As you heard us earlier refer to, the good news is the governor's recommending tobacco settlement dollars to pay off the $515 million in debt for the old Detroit Public Schools and an additional $200 million for the successor district that is part of his proposal. The new co, old co, which is what they refer to this legislation, that would essentially create a new Detroit Community School District, which would, all the existing students and schools would go into that. And then the old Detroit Public Schools is basically, it's a district of debt. It's the $700+ million in debt. And so by the Senate Bill 710 and 711 are essentially the governor's proposal, which would take the Act 18 dollars, which is a local property tax, would be used to help pay down the old debt. The Act 18 would still apply to the old co, whereas the school aid and any funds through that stay with the new co, with the new Detroit community schools. And then the additional tobacco dollars would go to the old co. These bills create the vehicles by which that can be done. Is that about right?
The tobacco would go to the
School aid.
new one
I'm sorry, the tobacco,
to replace the funds lost in old co.
I thought it said 515 it went to the old and 200 to the new. So it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, all the debt stays with the old co. There's the 200 million startup. So what happens is your 18 mils that's collected on second homes, rentals, and businesses, that would stay. And that collects roughly $72 million a year for Detroit Public Schools. That would stay and just pay off that debt. Well, when you don't use those local property tax dollars, then you have to draw more for the per pupil foundation out of the school aid fund. So all of the Detroit Public School students would be funded like a charter student. Now, the impact of that, $72 million a year, is $50 for every student across the state. The governor recognized that that would be a significant hurdle in getting this done. And one of the areas where we had concerns with was how can we guarantee that year after year, because this is an 8 to 10 year solution, we're going to be reimbursed. His proposal is to use the tobacco settlement funds. The manufacturers of tobacco products still have to give the state of Michigan roughly $280 million a year that we use for various things.
I had no idea there was money left.
I'm right there. I thought that was spent tenfold.
The Michigan Merit Award was paid for out of it. The 21st Century Jobs Fund by Governor Granholm was spent out of it. We're actually paying off our state's contribution of the Detroit bankruptcy back to the Budget Stabilization Fund. So it's been a hybrid of things. But what happens is it will transfer $72 million a year from those funds directly into the school aid fund to make up for that additional foundation allowance that those students would incur.
So, well, first thing, you say old co, new co? What's that language? What's this co?
Old company, new
When
company.
they did
Yeah.
when
It's just
GM,
like
old company.
GM.
Okay,
They basically
gotcha.
they took all the old
So
debt.
the 72 million that would come out of the tobacco settlement, and not that I can speculate on what property tax is going to do in Detroit, but is there something to sort of figure that adjustment years later?
Well, mechanism if the property tax value goes up
Yeah,
or goes down.
yeah. I'm
Yeah.
just curious. I mean,
I think from the standpoint of the debt's the debt, so that's quantified. How much it creates locally, maybe that cuts off sooner than the 10 years if those property values increase, but we're still going to get, for the number of students in DPS, that 72 million. And if I look at it a different way, if DPS continues to have declining enrollment, it's fewer students who would be accessing that higher amount of the school aid fund to fully fund their per pupil allocation. So in a twisted way, you might end up even on the bright side of it with having a stagnant 72 million transferred in each year.
Well, yeah, and remember, it has to be done each year. So you can foresee if there were any issues with it where they said, oh, the debt's gone down because tax, that they would cut that amount.
Yep.
So there's no guarantee that the old co would get 72 million a year.
okay.
So in addition to the Senate side, the House Republican caucus unveiled their version of the Detroit public school proposal. It varies significantly from the governor's. They pretty much loaded every education reform idea they've had into one bill, or package of bills. 5382 to 5384 are the bill numbers. This would include a balanced calendar, A to F grading accountability system, all new hires, and a 401k system, merit pay, as well as alternative certification for teachers are just among some of the things that are loaded into this. It's being shopped as a Detroit-only proposal, so they're promising that it would not apply to districts outside of Detroit. Obviously, you can imagine part of the concern there is they've loaded this up. These are things that are in other pieces of legislation that we know that certain reformers would like to see, and so if they do this for Detroit, it opens the door for it to go beyond. Not much different than the EAA codification and what's going with the SRO, where the intent all along was originally focused on Detroit, but then the SRO kind of opened the door so that it can go statewide, and that's one of those that makes us a little nervous. But according to Chris and his great report. By the way, I plagiarized much of this from Chris's Talent Triangle reports. That this kind of, obviously, there's an 8-year transition to a fully elected local board. That's something that Detroit is advocating for. This bill doesn't do that for 8 years. And I think there were concerns, obviously, among the Democrats in Detroit contingent about this legislation.
Yeah, though, in terms of recommendations or where this is going, the Senate essentially their bills are essentially dealing with debt and what to do in terms of that debt and going forward. And the big argument in the Senate is whether there's something called the DEC, Detroit Education Council, that essentially would be over both charter and public schools. You can imagine how both sides feel about that. And so that's the big fight there, but they aren't necessarily putting in quote-unquote reforms in the Senate bill. This is just to take care of the financial piece, and then I think they want to move into this. The House decided to take a different approach and sort of say, we're going to throw all the reforms out on the table that we can. This is going to move, the House is going to hold hearings this week on their legislation. I think there'll probably be bills passed out of committee by next week.
Who's leading this in the House? Who has this passion for reform?
Well, not taking their opinion, but just sharing it with you.
Right.
It is, if we're going to hand over $715 million.
Tell them how to do education.
Not only are we going to tell them how to do education, but we're going to try and change a entity that has resisted any sort of change for years and just continued to see declining enrollment. Rather than modifying itself to the new reality, which you guys know a lot about, there hasn't been this. And I think Republicans are saying, if we're going to invest these kinds of dollars, before we invest it, we need to see what the change is going to be, as opposed to maybe the Senate model where we're going to get the finances taken care of, and then we'll figure out what the changes are. So I get it. There's certainly many people, when you're spending those kinds of dollars, would want to know what things are being put into place to make sure this doesn't happen again. The avenue by which they get there, I think, could be disagreed upon by a lot of people. But so that's sort of where this is. The House and the Senate are, I think, communicating about what they're doing. They're not negotiating together. So my only point in saying all that is to say, this is going to change a lot, and I would just sort of watch and wait.
Yeah, this is certainly with their entrance into this conversation, it's going to make it tougher to get a comprehensive package done. So I think you're likely to see moving in an alternative appropriations bill, at least enough resources to keep the district moving
From
along.
going into bankruptcy.
Because they're supposed to be out of cash by April, right in that time frame. And then with an election season, you can see where it even gets trickier. And then if you load up a package that is deemed state heavy-handed and reform-minded, you'll likely see a lot of Detroit legislators and other Democratic legislators who will not be as inclined to support it, which means you need more Republican votes, which will be tough for it to come by. So this has got a long ways to go. And I think from our perspective in West Michigan, as we evaluate the policies and proposals, as what are the implications that it can have a broader statewide impact, so impact our course of business, and then obviously the financial piece, which largely has been addressed by not only the Senate, the governor, but the House is looking at an alternative funding source that would be suitable as well. So those are the ways in which we're looking at these bills that are literally hundreds of pages. It is meaty stuff, as you can imagine. ADAF letter grading, other things. There's a lot of substance, merit pay, to those topics that need a lot of thoughtful debate. And if we're going to move through an appropriations committee process in fairly short order, I am a little hesitant to be able to say if that thorough debate's going to occur for all of those topics, because
The fundamental difference between the two chambers is the Senate has sort of agreed to the governor's point that this is cheaper than bankruptcy. The House has said, we're not afraid of bankruptcy. And so that if you sort of boil it all down, the House is willing to to say bankruptcy is an option, given, they'll point to what happened in the city of Detroit and sort of how well that worked out, as opposed to the Senate and the governor saying it might be 3 billion if we don't do it for the 700 million. So I think that's probably you sort of boil it down to its common denominator. It's big stuff. It's big stuff.
I mean,
And kids are at stake. So.
You have special ed populations that are 15, 16%, double surrounding areas. The average cost can be upwards of $40,000. So if you have continued declining enrollment, elevated special education students, then you can see where it becomes tough to provide an academic environment in your standard classroom that will meet the needs and attract the kind of talent and student population that you want. So there's a lot of moving factors.
The other worry is that, this is going to address their current budget deficit, but they're losing 10,000 kids a year, and so they're going to go right into the red pretty quickly, potentially, if they don't stabilize their enrollment. And you throw into all those other X factors where their expenses are far exceeding their revenues, increased special ed, declining enrollment. I mean, it's just it's a mess.
And there hasn't been the sort of restructure that's happened in other places. There just hasn't been.
On that rosy note, actually, we'll move on to another piece of legislation here that we're going to ask for you to take a position on. This is Senate Bills 754 through 767. These are bills to eliminate unnecessary redundant reports and streamline the reporting requirements. It is, how could you, and actually, you know what, it's hats off to Senator Pete McGregor, who's one of the lead bill sponsors and has been leading this effort, where we've said to them, there's a patchwork of all of these things where we are required to jump through hoops and do reporting to the state that we're already doing to like 3 other entities. And so much of this kind of looks at SEPI, the Office of Retirement Services, and FID, which is the Federal Information Database. These are things we are already reporting to, yet then MDE and multiple things has us report separately. So I'll go through and give you some examples of what are in the bills. Right now, there's a Voc Ed report to MDE. This will combine with the FID. The Voc Ed report to the state is obsolete and should be replaced by MEGS, something that is another system we're already using. Annual record of professional development and annual record of professional development for beginning teachers. These bills would eliminate this because this information is already available in the REP system. Information required by SEPI and MDE for special ed reimbursements allow only if it's not already available in the federal database. Certification of eye protective devices, repeal that. The standards are obsolete. These are just giving you some examples. ISD report and consolidation of services. These package would repeal it. That was a one-time deal. That's another good one in here.
We get the gist.
You get the gist of it.
Do I have a motion to
So,
move this
So
to the
moved.
board?
I will make that
To
motion.
move this forward to the board?
Okay, go ahead.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Move that forward to the board for recommendation?
That should be easy.
This is sort of in the Republicans' wheelhouse.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Well,
the
good for
last thing-
McGregor on this. Boo on that whole historic district thing, though. Yeah, who are you kidding?
We'll talk. So the last item of the agenda is for us just to start to look at the meeting schedule, and I want to apologize if there was some confusion that was created when we had to cancel our regularly scheduled meeting, but then we...
My assistant and John's assistant got confused.
Right, and then when we created the Tuesday, which was only supposed to be a one-time reschedule, somehow it created a schedule of all Tuesdays, and that's legislative session days. These guys wouldn't be able to be there. I obviously could, but in an ideal scenario moving forward, we'd really like to look at Mondays or Fridays. And one of the
I'm
things
wondering about, go
I
ahead.
was going to suggest is, what about the 5:30 potentially before one of your regularly scheduled board meetings?
Time for that.
Then it would give the
I'm in better shape than you are.
No, I mean, John and I talked about it, and it would also give the
How about you,
opportunity for,
Bernard, said,
Rocket in one night.
It would also give the opportunity for board members to attend if they wanted to, previous to the
I
meeting.
just wondered with your work schedule.
Yeah, no, we were talking 5:30, 5:15.
Yeah, let's say 5:30 to 6:30. There's no reason we shouldn't be able to get, this was a big one today, and we got it done.
Yep, that'd be great.
That's good.
Okay. And then the other thing, Rusty and I, when we're hoping to talk about dates for your capital day. Do you have recommendation as to when you think we should consider this?
I do. The last week of March, first week of April is spring break. I would suggest that we do it after spring break, maybe that second or third week of April. That'll also allows me to get back from my honeymoon, so.
Where are you going?
Bora Bora.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So
So-
the week of April 11th or April 18th.
Yeah.
And do you have a preference of a Tuesday or Wednesday?
Tuesday or Wednesday, either are fine. We would want to sort of get that started now because we've got to get lots of things in place, meetings and
Yep.
all kinds of other things.
What about April 12th? I'm just throwing that out
Just
there.
as, the West Michigan Talent Triangle one will be on the 13th, so it's more centric in terms of bringing speakers to you. It's not as much of going
visiting,
directly
yep.
and visiting, so there's a difference there, but
That's helpful.
Academic achievements on the 12th.
What time?
And-
I got it on the 19th.
Oh, you do? Okay,
My
good.
calendar says 19th.
Okay, yeah, that's probably right. I have it on both, but I think I had it all on it.
Sandy, do you have that in front of you?
Yeah, I have it on the 19th too, so, yeah,
Well-
12th would be,
And we'll do visits, obviously, with local legislators, but more so, this is an opportunity to get to folks outside of our local area, since we see them a couple of times a year at legislative lunches and things.
it's the CLI Advisory Council meeting. 12th, I'm looking at the 12th.
Are you? I don't have that.
Really?
Excuse me.
Well, I'll look into it.
All right.
Let us know when we'll get stuff.
Yeah.
We'll begin to get things scheduled.
Be great.
Good.
I think the 12th.
We'll try and get the budget people to come in.
Yeah, I might have some comments.
But, and the reason I say that is by that time, we'll have a little more information as to what the subcommittees are, have reported out. And so we'll have we'll have actually something to say, to react to, as opposed to saying, here's where we are.
Yeah,
Good job,
right.
guys, we like it.
Yeah, right.
So,
Yep. Good.
All right. That's it?
Yeah,